This presentation is brought to you by the ScHO Foundation. Over 50 years of research towards curing cancer the natural way.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I just flew in from Lisbon last night, and good to be back home. I grew up kind of just up the road in Connecticut. My wife Penny is from Connecticut. Her father worked down here in Manhattan, so back in the days when we were dating, spent a lot of time in New York City. My wife and I come here about 4 times a year, so kind of our second home. So thanks for having me. We're going to talk about my latest book will actually be coming out next week. And actually, I'm going to spend some time. Actually, I'm going to be on the Tamara Hall show Monday morning for the Plant Paradox Family Cookbook. You guys are lucky enough to get another New York Times bestseller, which is the easy read. We kind of call it the Cliff Notes of the Plant Paradox, the Plant Paradox Quick and Easy. And today I'm going to talk about my other bestseller, The Longevity Paradox. And it's called How to Die Young at a Ripe Old Age. And that's actually the paradox. Most of us would really like to live a long time, but we don't want to get old. And that's the paradox. And so through my research at both of my clinics, I still see patients 6 and 7 days a week. We put together a guide on how to do this. So with no further ado. So this picture was taken of me in June of 2008. This picture was taken in June of 2019. And not bad for 11 years apart. And if you actually look at my blood work from 25 years ago, I am actually a much younger man than I was 20 years ago. So it is possible to not only stop aging, but I'm convinced through my patient work and certainly on myself that it's possible to de-age. So recently we presented the Longevity Paradox up in Canada, and this was me on their National Today show, so I just threw that in. Now, here's the important part. If you think of nothing else from this talk, I want you to take this slide away from you. So your fate is not controlled by your genes, contrary to everything you've been taught. Your genes actually make up only 1% of the genetic material within you. The microbiome, the bacteria, the viruses, the fungi, the parasites that live in and on you contribute 8 million different unique genes, while humans have only 20,000 genes. In fact, if you really want to feel bad, corn has far more genes than you do. And you're thinking, well, I certainly have the most genes of any animal because I'm certainly the finest animal there is. Unfortunately, a little flea has far more genes than you do. So what makes you unique is that you have an incredibly huge microbiome, and that genetic material is actually the most of anything in you. In fact, a study in Nature in 2018 showed that the gut microbiome, controls over 90% of the things that are going to happen to you in your lifetime. 90% of what's going to happen to us, me, you, is controlled by our bugs. Now, the reason that this is so interesting, and the reason we should be interested in this, how many people have heard about mitochondria? Everybody? Good. So mitochondria are our energy factories in all of our cells. What hopefully most of you know is that mitochondria themselves are actually ancient engulfed bacteria. Long, long ago, they decided to get eaten by another cell. And in exchange for a nice place to live, they said, okay, you give us something to eat and we'll make all the energy you need. So all eukaryotic cells, that's you and me, actually have engulfed bacteria that generate energy. Now, what's fascinating about mitochondria is that they actually have their own DNA. And the mitochondria actually divide and replicate separate from nuclear DNA. And what that means for you is, normally we think of one cell dividing and making 2 new cells or making a replacement cell. But mitochondria can actually divide at any time without the rest of the cell dividing. Now, here's the really kind of spooky part. Mitochondria are actually inherited from your mother. So you inherited all of your mitochondria from mom. Dad contributed nothing to your mitochondria. Many of you are suspicious that your father really contributed nothing to you. Now, it's interesting, your mother did more than that. She actually contributed your microbiome from her. Now, just because we're bad-mouthing dads, it turns out, many of you are suspicious of this, that your mother, as you exited the birth canal, took a crap on you. And she did. And she actually gave you your microbiome. And we know that, for instance, children who are born with cesarean section, anybody have a C-section? Anybody's kids were born by C-section? Okay. So we know that babies who are born with C-section actually have a completely altered microbiome. They actually have a skin flora microbiome, and it may take 6 months or longer for babies who are born by C-section to establish an almost normal microbiome. And that's why actually I write prescriptions for my patients who are pregnant in the potential that they will have a C-section, that their obstetrician should take a vaginal swab, a sponge, and then the minute the baby is born, swab the baby's mouth and nose with the mother's vaginal swab, just to do that. So, what's so important about this, and again, this is where it gets kind of do-do-do-do, the mitochondria and the microbiome are actually sisters. And they actually talk to each other just like sisters do. And we use chemical text messages. And this has recently been proven that, in fact, the status of the microbiome tells the mitochondria how things are going and whether the mitochondria actually ought to produce energy, how much energy the mitochondria should produce, and whether the mitochondria should actually grow and divide normally. All from their sisters in the microbiome. So, recently, we found that Hippocrates, the father of medicine, 2,500 years ago was right. And Hippocrates said that all disease begins in the gut. Now, this was 2,500 years ago. Pretty prescient guy. We now know through experiments that aging occurs with a subtle breakdown of the single cell wall separating what you swallow, your microbiome, and you. And that single cell wall is the same surface as a tennis court. So this room is actually slightly smaller than a tennis court, but you get the idea. So kind of look around for a second. This surface area in this room is inside of you right now. And you're going, no, it's not. There's no way. In fact, it is. And that's because your gut is only a single cell thick from your mouth all the way to your rear end. And that's the surface area. And that gut wall is only 1 cell thick. And so imagine if you were going to make a bad design to keep everything you swallow, all the nasty bacteria that might potentially live in you, away from you, you'd probably have more than a single cell to do that job. But in fact, that's how we're designed. And evidence shows that that wall, and whether or not it's intact, is going to determine actually how fast you age and what diseases you're going to have. So, in other words, the stronger that wall, the more mucus on top of that wall, and we'll get into that, the less lectins. And anybody know about lectins? Oh, some people don't. This is great. Wonderful. Lectins are the way of plants trying to keep you from eating them, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Believe it or not, plants have a life, and they have evolutionary pressures, and they don't want you to eat them or their babies. And so they use a protein called lectins. So the more your wall's intact, the less lectins you eat, the less you age. That's encouraging because we can actually control the process. Now, this is one of my favorite animals. This is the naked mole rat. Anybody heard of the naked mole rat? Good. It's actually maybe one of the ugliest creatures ever described. The naked mole rat, it lives in sub-Saharan Africa in tunnels, and the naked mole rat is the longest living rat that has ever been described. In fact, the naked mole rat lives anywhere from 10, 20 to 30 times longer than any other rat. So your cute little mouse or rat that runs around your house or your yard lives about 2 years. The naked mole rat can live 20, 30, 40 or more years. Whoa! And it's the same, species as rats. Now, some people, this is a New York audience, some people have described this cute little critter as a penis with buck teeth. And that's probably what you're going to take away from this talk. Now, the reason I'm showing you this cute little guy is they actually live very much like colonies of ants or bees. And there's actually a queen of naked mole rats. But what is interesting about these rats is they don't eat what other rats eat. Rats in general eat grains. They are grain predators. But this guy eats tubers, roots, and fungi, and we'll get back to that. They actually have huge amounts of hyaluronic acid, and anybody who thinks about skin health knows all about hyaluronic acid. And they actually make huge amounts of hyaluronic acid so that they are slippery enough to bend and wiggle through their underground tunnels. Now here's the really exciting thing that researchers have been fascinated with. A naked mole rat has the same gut microbiome as a healthy 105-year-old. Wow. And it turns out that a healthy 105-year-old has the same microbiome as a healthy 30-year-old. And it turns out that this is not without reason. It turns out that the microbiome of all these animals predict them living a long time, including humans. So I want to talk about myths of aging. And part of the longevity paradox is that there are really some very bad myths of aging that are constantly held up as what is going to happen to us as we age. Now, the first one is the blue zones, as described by the journalist Dan Buttner, eat whole grains and beans, and that promotes longevity. Everybody heard that? Yeah, the secret to longevity is whole grains and beans? Well, unfortunately, that's not true. I am the only nutritionist who has ever actually spent most of their career in a blue zone, and that was Loma Linda, California. Loma Linda is the only blue zone in the United States. So I guess I know what I'm talking about. Nobody else, no other nutritionist, has ever lived in a blue zone. Several studies show that actually cereal grains are a negative component of these diets that are actually compensated for by other components. So in other words, the grains that are eaten in, say, Sardinia, or the grains that are eaten in Crete, are compensated for by all the olive oil, all the red wine, all the certain fruits and vegetables that these people eat that compensate for the negative effect. Indeed, in Loma Linda, our favorite product was called texturized vegetable protein, or TVP, which is actually soybeans that have been extruded under high pressure and high heat to make mystery meat, as we like to call it at Loma Linda. They knew, the clever Adventists, that you had to pressure cook beans to destroy the lectins, and that's what we did. Now, interestingly, despite grains and beans being good for you, there's certain blue zones like Okinawa. There's a recently discovered blue zones, the Katavans in Papua New Guinea, that eat no or minimal grains or beans. In fact, the Okinawans, 85% of their diet is a purple sweet potato. That's hardly a grain or a bean. The Katavans eat no grains, they eat no beans. Oh, and by the way, the Okinawans do eat rice. They eat 6% of their diet is white rice. And the Okinawan researchers said, gee, wouldn't the Okinawans, who are one of the oldest living people, longest living people, be so much healthier if we could convince them to eat brown rice instead of white rice? Now think about that for a minute. We're studying the world's oldest living people, and we're so sure of ourselves that we're going to try to convince the oldest living people to change their diet to brown rice because it's so much healthier and they could live so much longer. No, we have to have our eyes open. We have to say, wait a minute, one of the oldest living people in the world eat white rice instead of brown rice. What are they trying to tell us? And in fact, 4 billion people use rice as their staple. And guess what color of rice 4 billion people eat? Right, white rice. They don't eat brown rice. Are 4 billion people that stupid? They've been taking the hull off of rice for a very long time because the hull contains the lectins. It's just like the Italians. The Italians do not eat whole grain bread. They do not eat whole grain pasta. The French do not eat whole grain baguettes. They do not eat whole grain croissants. They've been taking the hull off of wheat for 10,000 years because they knew that the hull was dangerous to them. Oh, and by the way, the Italians always peel and de-seed their tomatoes before they make sauce because there are lectins in the peels and seeds of tomatoes. In fact, I was just visiting some chefs in Tuscany 2 months ago and going through their organic gardens, and to a person, they have beautiful tomatoes, Roma tomatoes, and I said, oh, what do you do with those? And they said, oh, we make pasta sauce. I said, oh, well, how do you do that? And they said, well, you have to peel and de-seed the tomato before you make the pasta sauce because the peels and seeds are lethal. And I said, really? Where'd you learn that? Oh, my mother taught me. Well, where'd she learn that? My grandmother taught her. And turns out all of Italy, I've been to Sicily, I've been everywhere in Italy, everyone peels and de-seeds their tomatoes before they make sauce. And by the way, if you thought that there were certain Italian foods that were indigenous to Italy, tomatoes are actually from America. And no Italian ever had a tomato until 500 years ago when their native son Columbus brought them back. So tomatoes are a brand new food to Italy. And by the way, pizza was invented in 1890. It's a very modern food. Okay. Sorry. Myth number 2. Animal protein is essential for strength and longevity. I mean, everybody knows that. Turns out that studies of Seventh-day Adventists by my colleague Gary Fraser show that of the long-lived Seventh-day Adventists, the vegans live the longest of those long-lived people. And Gary Fraser shows that any amount of animal protein added to the Adventist diet increases not only the risk of death, but the risk of heart disease. Now, this makes me cry every time I talk to him and read his studies, because I grew up in Omaha, Nebraska, and, where meat is king. There ought to be a Smith and Walensky's on every corner because, beef for breakfast, pork for lunch, and a side of beef for dinner. But I've come around, again, living in a blue zone for most of my life, that animal protein ages us. And it does that because it stimulates mTOR. Anybody heard of mTOR? Great. mTOR is basically an energy receptor. I became very interested in mTOR as a transplant surgeon when we were working on new transplant drugs. And rapamycin, which was one of the transplant drugs we were experimenting with in the 1980s, whenever we develop a new transplant drug, we test it in animals to see what sort of dose is going to kill that animal. In other words, shorten its life. Because these are dangerous drugs. Rapamycin, the more you gave these animals, the longer they lived. And we went, what the heck? Why is that? Well, people a lot smarter than me developed a test that showed that there was a sensor on all of our cells called the mammalian target of rapamycin, mTOR. Now, it's subsequently been discovered that even plants or a reptile have a mammalian target of rapamycin, and they're not mammals. So it's now called the mechanistic target of rapamycin, but and some people just call it TOR, but the name's stuck, so it's mTOR. So it turns out that animal proteins, certain amino acids in animal proteins, stimulate mTOR far more than amino acids in plants. And here's the bad news. The more you stimulate mTOR, the shorter you live. The more you block mTOR, the longer you live. And what rapamycin was basically blocking mTOR. It was fooling mTOR. And there are actually a few physicians, who take small doses of rapamycin in effect to slow their aging. I don't, and very good reason. As a transplant surgeon, this is a really risky slope to play with. There's a lot of easier ways. I'll show you. Number 3, growth hormones promote youthfulness and vitality. No. Turns out that most blue zone people are short. And sad to say, if you're tall, you have a much shorter lifespan than if you're short. So all you nice short people, you guys are the big winners if you don't screw it up. And in fact, there are people that I talk about who are called Lorans, that we'll talk about in a minute, who have no growth hormone receptors, and they're very short. They live in South America, but they have absolutely no cancer or diabetes. They don't actually live a very long time because, unfortunately, most of these people have been introduced to alcohol, and they really like alcohol. I'll leave it at that. An analysis of 1,700 men and women found that people of the same height had the same lifespan. So it turns out that women live longer than men because you guys in general are shorter than men. And next time you happen to look through the obituaries, I want you to start looking for NBA basketball players who have lived over 100 years of age. And you'll notice there aren't any. And there is actually a direct inverse relationship between height and longevity. In fact, to scare you even more, rapid growth during adolescence resulted in an 80% risk of cancer 15 years later than if you grew normally. Growth is really overrated. So when you start seeing this current generation, particularly in Asia with 6'5", 7-footers coming out of Asia, it's all because of a change in diet. Now this goes along with that. Myth number 4, a high metabolic rate is a sign of good health. And you see this in advertisements all the time. Oh, you've got to have a high metabolic rate so you can burn calories, because burning calories is the way you keep off weight. Well, It turns out that digesting protein requires a lot of energy. In fact, it's one of the reasons the carnivore diet causes weight loss. It's one of the reasons the Atkins diet causes weight loss. We actually burn up 30% of the calories in protein digesting that protein, and that creates heat. And it turns out that heat ages us. That's why your dog or your cat has a temperature about 2 degrees higher than you. That's why there's a 3-dog night. And boy, could we have used it last night at the night. Your dogs are warm, and that's why your dogs, unfortunately, live much less long than you do, because they are burning energy. Now, the problem with heat is that you can take heat and combine it with protein and sugar and produce what's called advanced glycation end products, better known as AGED. How many people have seen the commercials saying, I got my A1C down? Right? So A1C is a measurement of the advanced glycation end products attached to the hemoglobin molecule on red blood cells. And that basically tells you or me or your doctor that the last 2 months, how much sugar and protein is in your diet, along with the heat that you have. So anybody look at their hands and see an age spot or a sunspot or a liver spot on the back of their hands? No good. You don't want to see that. If you see that, that is a marker of you aging. Now, that's what it is. In fact, I used to have bunches of them on my hands, and they all went away. I have one little one I'm working on, but they all fell off. And in fact, as I write in my books, a rather humorous story, I was seeing a couple who are snowbirds in Palm Springs from Oregon, and they drive their RV from Portland to Palm Springs every fall about this time. And they had been on my program for the first year, and they were coming back to Palm Springs, and the gentleman was driving the car, and his wife was watching him with the steering wheel, and she said, George, look at your hands. And of course, George did this, and he drove off the road. And now, nothing was hurt. Well, what she was noticing was that all of his age spots had disappeared. And so you can actually reverse aging. So I want you, if you leave here with nothing else, I want you to get rid of your age spots, because that's a perfectly direct way of looking at how fast or slow you're aging. Myth number 5, get plenty of iron as you age. I grew up in the Geritol age, where everybody had iron poor blood, and Geritol with Ted Mack and the original Amateur Hour. Boy, am I dating myself. He sold iron tonics. It turns out that people who donated the most blood most frequently in Denmark and Sweden lived significantly longer than those who donated the least. Exactly what you would be the opposite. It turns out that iron causes oxygen deficits in mitochondria. And we know that iron concentrates in an area of the brain called the substantia nigra, which is highly associated with Parkinson's. And in Parkinson's patients, donating blood actually improves the symptoms of Parkinson's disease. So iron ages you dramatically. That's why if you have a cast iron skillet at home, please throw it away. It's one of the most dangerous things you have in your house. If you have them, make sure they're coated with ceramic or porcelain, but don't use a raw cast iron skillet. Ladies, if you are heavy spinach eaters, please back off. Lastly, it turns out that green tea or black tea will leach iron out of you. That's why every day at the office I have about 5 cups of green tea just to keep my iron level low. Myth number 6, saturated fat should not be demonized. Now here's the problem. Back in the mid-1950s, President Eisenhower had a heart attack. And it was a shock to the nation because here was an extremely thin, fit, general, the, savior of World War II, who had a heart attack. And they went, what the heck is going on here? So they called in a professor of nutrition from the University of Minnesota by the name of Ancel Keys. Now, Ancel Keys invented the K ration for World War II that fed all of our troops. These were prepared little sardine cans of food. And so who best to figure out why Dwight Eisenhower had a heart attack than Ancel Keys? And Ancel Keys did a study, which he published, called the 7 Countries Study. And he looked at 7 countries and what they ate and looked at the degree of heart disease in these countries. And what he concluded was that the more saturated fat, animal saturated fat in people's diets, the higher the cholesterol, not the higher the cholesterol, but the higher the degree of heart disease. And that actually established the cholesterol and fat theory of heart disease. Now, I've studied Ancel Keys. Actually, Ancel Keys is tied for the longest living nutritionist who has ever lived. He died at 102. Interestingly enough, Ancel Keys, when he retired, moved to a village just south of Naples, Italy, a village just north of Acciaroli, the newest blue zone. And Ancel Keys ate huge amounts of olive oil, a fat. And so he was not demonizing fat. What he was saying, we got to be suspicious of saturated animal fat. Now, I've read everything he's ever written, and he's been demonized by the paleo community, by the keto community. But, I came here to praise Dr. Keys, not to bury him. Because what he didn't notice is that animal fat is almost always associated with animal protein. And if we had his data to work with again, I think we would have found it was the animal protein associated with the animal fat that was the troublemaker. In fact, plant fat, that is from olive oil and avocados, is associated with longevity, as proven in recent studies, while animal fat is not. Myth number 7. Milk does a body good. We've all seen those wonderful commercials. Unfortunately, it's exactly the opposite of what advertising would have you say. Cow's milk is loaded with insulin-like growth factor 1, IGF-1, which is designed to make baby cows grow rapidly. Think about it, if you're actually an antelope or a cow or a goat, and there's a wolf or coyote or lion, you would like your newborn baby to grow as quickly as possible, get some strong legs to be able to run away as quickly as possible. On the other hand, humans are extremely slow growing, as any mother knows. You kind of wish they'd grow a little quicker, and then you wish they would slow down. But our cows, like any other cow, make large amounts of insulin-like growth factor. And we are not baby cows, as I try to remind all of my pregnant women and the mothers who I take care of. Now, there's another problem with cow milk, in that most North American cows make a protein that's a lectin-like protein called casein A1, not casein A2. Casein A2 is present in goats, sheep, water buffaloes. Casein A1 actually acts as a lectin and can cause leaky gut. So really the last thing you want to give your children, or yourself for that matter, is our American cow milk. Now, interestingly enough, and I show this in Longevity Paradox, aged cheeses like Parmesan Reggiano contain what are called polyamines, which, if you ingest them, promote longevity. And there's several wonderful sources of polyamines besides Parmesan Reggiano cheese. Mushrooms are loaded with them. In fact, a study out of Singapore last year showed that people who on average ate 2 cups of mushrooms a week, that's actually not much, have a 90% reduction in Alzheimer's compared to people who didn't eat 2 cups of mushrooms per week. So have some mushrooms. Here's where polyamines are found. And oh, by the way, one of the polyamines is spermidine, and I know it's a New York audience, but I'm not going to tell you where you can find it. Use your imagination. So these compounds are found in shellfish, fermented foods, cruciferous vegetables, leafy greens, mushrooms, matcha green tea, nuts, chicken liver, and lentils. In fact, one of the newest discovered blue zones, the Acciarolis of Italy, south of Naples, they actually eat no bread, they eat no pasta, they eat some lentils, which have been soaked for 48 hours and the water changed to get rid of the lectins, and they eat anchovies, rosemary, and a ton of olive oil, and yes, they like their wine. Okay, here's the test. You're going to all have to say this 3 times before you can leave the room. So there is a bug that lives in you, if you're lucky, called Akkermansia mucinophilia. Say that 3 times quickly. Go. No. So this bug, it turns out, is probably the key to gut wall integrity. This bug lives in the mucus layer that lines your gut. Everybody knows what mucus is. I hear a few people sniffling. It's mucus season. And so mucus is mucopolysaccharides. That means multiple sugars. And this mucus absorbs lectins. Lectins are proteins that bind to sugar molecules. So next time your nose runs, when you bite into a jalapeno pepper, you are actually producing mucus to grab all those lectins in that jalapeno pepper. In fact, there's a joke that we are the only animal that would ever take a second bite out of a jalapeno pepper. Think about that. So this bug loves mucus. Now you'd think, well, that's not a good thing because it's eating all this protective barrier. But the more mucus this bug eats, it actually makes the gut wall cells produce more mucus. So it's actually a win-win. Now, anybody take metformin? It's okay if you do. You don't have to raise your hand. Metformin, the popular diabetic drug, it's also very popular in longevity circles. I do not take it, but I have a number of my colleagues who do. Metformin works not by lowering your blood sugar, but it actually works because it increases Akkermansia growth. So a drug is actually making a bug grow better. It also turns out that your mucus and your Akkermansia proliferates during fasting. And the actual benefit of fasting, one of the very strong benefits, it gives you a chance to make more mucus and more Akkermansia. It can live off your mucus whether other bacteria can't. Now, the other key of Akkermansia is it loves inulin-containing foods. Anybody know a food that has inulin? Come on, somebody does. Chicory. So the chicory family, radicchio, Belgian endive, chicory, frisee, these are rich inulin-containing foods. I had dinner in an Italian restaurant last night, and guess what was on the menu? A chicory salad. In fact, I just got back from Lisbon. Every salad in Lisbon had radicchio, chicory, and frisee. Every one of the salads. That's because they know, whether they know it or not, that these are foods that promote the best bug in your gut. Now, there's other sources. Jerusalem artichokes, sometimes called sunchokes. Artichoke hearts are rich in that. So those are some of your options. Now, I mentioned fasting. Now, there's a lot of terms out there for fasting. There is water fasting, where you actually don't have anything to eat. There's time-restricted feeding, where you limit the amount of time during the day that you actually eat. And so, for instance, during the winter, which is rapidly approaching from January through June, I'll be entering my 18th year of doing this. During the week, I eat no breakfast, I eat no lunch. I eat all my calories in a 2-hour window between 6 and 8 o'clock at night. So 22 out of 24 hours I'm fasting. Now, Dr. Dale Bredesen, my friend who wrote The End of Alzheimer's, thinks that all of us should have at least a 14-hour window of not eating every day. And if we have any degree of mild cognitive impairment or any of his Alzheimer's patients, that window goes to 16 hours a day. And you're going, 16 hours? Oh, come on. Well, remember, sleeping counts as not eating. And the other thing we always have to remember is the word breakfast means break fast. And did you really believe our ancestors crawled out of our caves and said, "What's for break fast?" There was no breakfast. We had no storage system. There wasn't a refrigerator. There wasn't a pantry. We had to find breakfast. And if we didn't find breakfast until lunch, lunch was breakfast. So we are actually designed to fast and skip meals. In fact, there's significant evidence that the reason we became the cockroach of the mammal kingdom and took over the world is our ability to go extended periods of time without eating. We also know that mitochondrial flexibility, the ability of mitochondria to use sugar for fuel, glucose, or to use fat for fuel in terms of ketones, is probably one of the keys to long-term health. And most of us have absolutely no mitochondrial flexibility. It's kind of like going from a battery to gas engine back and forth. We should have that ability to switch simultaneously. Most of us are stuck on gasoline. What's really interesting about fasting is that it promotes autophagy and mitophagy. What the heck is that? Simplest way to think about this. When cells reach the end of their lifespan, they basically can do one of two things. They can recycle themselves. They can take all the cellular components, all the proteins, all the fats, and rebuild a new cell. Take a few extra things and rebuild a new cell. That's called autophagy. Unfortunately, what happens in most of us is the cell literally explodes. It's called apoptosis. Kind of like, think of the Death Star exploding in Star Wars. And it spews debris all over, and that debris causes inflammation. Recently, we've learned that the mitochondria do the same thing, and they can either recycle their components and build a new mitochondria, and that's called mitophagy, or that they can explode. And one of the latest theories of dementia and of even heart failure is that these mitochondria are bits and debris that stop the cell from making energy properly. So fasting promotes not only autophagy, but mitophagy. And bonus, it turns out that when you're fasting, you want to turbocharge your engine so that you can make more power out of what limited resources you have. So think about this. You take a V8 engine, which is guzzling gas, and suddenly there's an oil crisis, and there isn't any gas. It's a whole lot better to take a 4-cylinder engine, put 2 turbochargers on it, and produce the power of the V8 engine while sipping gas. Now think about that from a personal perspective. If how are you going to make it long term? Would you rather be a turbocharged 4-cylinder, or would you like to be a Hummer? The Hummer will get you up to speed pretty quickly, but you're going to visit the gas station and then the gas will wear out. So that's the benefit of fasting. All right, now in the longevity paradox, I start talking about the concept of brainwashing. And I'm trying to brainwash you today, but that has nothing to do with that. Recently, a lymphatic system of the brain, which is called the glymphatic system, has been discovered. And little did we know that the brain undergoes a wash cycle during deep sleep, where the brain literally shrinks about 20%. And there is a tidal wave of fluid that goes into the brain and literally washes out toxins out of the brain, things like tau proteins, things like amyloid. Now here's the bad news. Deep sleep occurs early in the sleep cycle, almost right after you fall asleep. During that time, you actually have to have increased blood flow. Now, anybody who grew up in the era where your mother, after you ate lunch, made you not go in the water for an hour because you get cramps and die? Yeah, me too. It turns out there was a bit of truth to that wives' tale. And when we eat, because protein digestion is so energy dependent, most of our blood flow during that time goes down to our gut to assist with digestion. So if you eat close to when you go to bed, right after you go to bed is when deep sleep occurs. If all that blood is heading down to your gut, you don't get the blood flow you need to produce a brainwash. So you don't have to wait. You should probably wait 3 to 4 hours after your final meal before going to bed. Dale Bredesen would like you to have 3. I'd prefer 4. But you're not going to do that every night. I realize that. And in New York, you'd be shot dead if you showed up at a restaurant before 8 o'clock. In Portugal, they look at you funny when you arrive at 10 and say, what are you doing here? You must be a tourist. So one day a week, either skip dinner or eat and finish before 6 p.m. That's all I ask of you. One day a week of a brainwash. And it's amazing what can happen long term. Now, it's no sense in getting old if you can't remember your old age. And we're beginning to realize that's one of the huge longevity paradoxes. We look down the road and we see our loved ones or our grandparents in a nursing home, in assisted living, in a memory care, and they may have gotten old, but certainly not the quality of life that any of us would want. Now here's the exciting study that recently came out of Spain, the Predimed study. They took 65-year-old people, and I'll condense this. They were divided into three groups, and essentially one group, they both followed a Mediterranean diet. They were followed for 5 years. One group had to consume 1 liter of olive oil per week. That's about 10 to 12 tablespoons a day. They actually had to bring their container back to the clinic, exchange it for a new one. This went on for 5 years. The other group was placed on a low-fat Mediterranean diet. At the end of 5 years, in other words, when they were 70 years of age, the olive oil group had better memory than they had when they were 65. Better. The low-fat group, as one of us would have expected, actually lost memory because they were 5 years older. And it got even better than that. The people with coronary artery disease in both groups, the olive oil group had a 30% reduction in new events compared to the low-fat group. And the women in the olive oil group had a 67% reduction in breast cancer compared to the low-fat group. So olive oil is one of the best ways to protect your brain. Now, there's some other great ways. Coffee, tea, and chocolate, extra dark chocolate, increase this substance called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, that actually makes neurons grow. So I had some 86% dark chocolate last night, and I feel so much smarter already. Now, here's some other exciting news. 2 studies have shown there's an index called the omega-3 index, and it basically says how much of the important long-chain omega-3s have been in you for the last 2 months, EPA and DHA. The higher the omega-3 index, the bigger the brain in humans, and the bigger the hippocampus, the area of memory. The lower the omega-3 index, the smaller and the most shrunken the brains were, and the smallest areas of memory. Another study showed that 1 serving of greens per day slowed cognitive decline by 11 years compared to people who did not eat one serving of greens. And here's one of my favorites. Women who routinely exercise throughout their lives lowered their risk of Alzheimer's disease by 90% compared to women who did not routinely exercise. And maybe here's even the better news. The women who were predisposed to develop Alzheimer's or who eventually would get Alzheimer's, the exercising group got Alzheimer's 11 years later than the non-exercising group. Now think about that. Imagine getting Alzheimer's at 80, not a great thing, versus 91. I mean, imagine what those 11 years could do for you. Imagine what your kids would think, or imagine what your spouse would think. Imagine what you would think, and I mean that literally, just by doing something that's free. And then, believe it or not, walking a dog works really good as an exercise program. Finally, I'm going to leave you with this. The godfather of fitness, who I actually got to know before he died, Jack LaLanne. Now, he had a favorite expression, and he said, if it tastes good, spit it out. Now, what he was actually trying to say is that if you eat for your microbiome, if you eat for your bugs, which constitute the vast majority of the cells within you, that constitute the vast amount of genes within you, if you eat for them, and believe me or not, eating for them is really tasty, they'll keep you alive and well. And Jack would actually still be with us. He died at 96 of pneumonia when he refused to take antibiotics. And that was, I understand why he did it, but that was one of the dumb things he did. Because he'd still be with us. But anyhow, so there he is, and that was actually taken at 95, so pretty doggone good. All right, so I will leave you with that, and thank you so much for your attention. It's been a long day.